In the previous episode we talked about object permanence, constant conjunction, cause and effect, necessary and sufficient conditions, and I think I must have mentioned my own concern with the rise of right-wing extremism and fascism. There seems to be a lot of noise in it too, lots of nasty rhetoric and intimidation, and how much of that actually spills over into actual violence, I'm not so sure, but it certainly seems to be there. However, it's sad to me to learn that actually there's a very high percentage of people that harbour bigoted and racist views. Turns out even some people that I used to call friends. So much, it seems that violence doesn't actually need to occur to do harm. It's quite topical really, as social media has many stories of institutional bias and racism. It's certainly flavour of the month, if not the year. However, on a side note, as the normative window moves further right, and as violence goes more or less unpunished, becomes more apt to take place. And it's somewhat of a relief and a small win to hear or read about the Golden Dawn being found guilty in Greece of being a criminal organisation, with verdicts of murder, attempted murder and violent attacks on immigrants and left-wing political opponents were also delivered. This is what I'm talking about, so it's good to see justice apparently working, at least in one corner of the world. Modern Greece. Yet, when I've actually listened to racists give their spiel, it's devoid of facts, not really any arguments either. Lots of emotional sentiment, nationalism, cries of things like take back our country, control our borders, send them back, that kind of thing. When the facts and data is pointed out, often the response is, I don't believe you, or I don't agree with that. Such statements are offered as counter-arguments. It's as though who speaks last qualifies as the truth. It's as though they think merely being in disagreement is enough to qualify as a convincing counter-argument, or that, as such, the assertion so made qualifies as truth. Opinion then, my truth, my delusion, my prejudice is true. I get quite annoyed with this. It is frustrating having these conversations because there's just no room for learning, there's no room for change, and I end up asking them, wow, are you anywhere near the political apparatus, or are you anywhere near a position of significant influence in politics? And they say no, and then I respond, wow, thank God for that. And that's pretty much where it ends. That seems to really tick them off because it's all about the power for these. You know, where do they fit in this hierarchy? When you point out, no mate, you're just down at the bottom like the rest of us. Yeah. Anyway, there was a paper just published. What's the date on it? It says volume 170 in the Personality and Individual Differences journal. The title of the paper is Right-Wing Authoritarians Aren't Very Funny. RWA Personality and Creative Humour Production. And the conclusion is that overall people high in RWA, right-wing authoritarianism, appear to be much less funny. And I have to say, you know, on first inspection, it kind of makes sense. When I was doing background reading on saving face, politeness theory, and the moral philosophy of contempt, you know, because that's what I like, that's what I like to read in my spare time, I came across the philosophy of humour, theory of humour. And this is another thing that gets me about, you know, the kind of right-wing authoritarians who hide behind, it's just a joke. I think we mentioned before on the channel, is it Schrödinger's comic? This is the notion where you say something that's obviously offensive, and that's not necessarily bad in of itself, but when it's a wrapper to racism, the infamous one that did the rounds a few years ago, you know, the pug that was trained to do the Nazi salute. Yeah, okay. I don't know how far you can stretch it, talking about gassing a certain selection of peoples, and then justifying it after the fact. So, if the audience laughs because they think that burning people alive is funny, you know you've found your audience. But if the audience objects and calls it out for what it is, then you can deny it by saying, it was just a joke. So it's only after the reaction to the statement does the comedian, and I use that phrase loosely, then ascribe as to whether it's actually inciting racial hatred or whether it's a joke. So the intent is only revealed after the audience reveals themselves, hence it's called Schrödinger's comedy. The intent is only revealed after the box is opened. It's not a theory of comedy I recognise. So when these people are asked, they say, well, I am a comedian, it's what I do, I tell jokes on YouTube. When they are asked, okay, explain the theory of comedy as a professional comic, I assume they would know. They haven't got a clue. So they're not even, again, it's making the excuse after the event to cover their racism and bigotry. Yeah, so it's interesting reading up about the superiority theory, the relief theory, and the incongruity theory of humour. But at the basis of any joke, what it seems to me is that the comedian has skillfully built a rapport with the audience and then said things in an ambiguous way that leads the audience up their own garden path of their own making, from their own prejudices, from their own expectations of the given facts, but they don't have the full context. And then the comic violates that expectation in quite a sharp way that reveals to us our own prejudice. And I think in there we can go many different ways. We can realise the skill and brilliance of the comic for having outmanoeuvred us. So, kind of laugh at their superiority in a situation. Or because everybody else in the audience finds it funny and they've too revealed that they've had the same prejudice and same expectations as us, that brings a certain amount of relief. Wow, I'm just like them. And if they can find humour in being jibed at, then so can I. It makes it okay for my prejudices to be challenged, and I can soften the boundaries on those prejudices or biases and, be a bit more cool with the world. And of course, pointing out the hypocrisy that we all have. A great book, Kurzban, what was his name? I can't remember his first name. Kurzban is a neuroscientist, wrote a book called Why Everyone is a Hypocrite. No, that's not true. It was called Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite. And I did a 15-part analysis in the Facebook group. One of the things he points out is that, of course, we have all these different parts in our mind, if you like, different contexts of things, different notions about things, different conceptual ideas, and at any given time we can be operating from different parts and different notions, and it creates largely an incongruent mess. But we seem to select which parts are active depending on context. So we might do opposite things given the same set of rules, but in a different context. So, of course, we're all hypocrites, and the joke in the title of the book is that, of course, it doesn't apply to me. But I think this brings us back to this authoritarian right-wing mindset that it's the inability to change, it's the inability to recognise that one might be wrong, it's the inability to realise that there are these biases and expectations and prejudices. It doesn't seem to occur to them that it's even possible for them to not even necessarily be wrong, but that the way that I think about things is the way that it naturally is, of course, and you're just maniacs for thinking in different ways. And as I've said before on the channel, it's almost as though thinking about things in different ways or holding different ideas, different perceptions about similar things from different points of view is difficult for some people. They don't like the ambivalence, they don't like the ambiguity. And in some ways, I think they've built unconscious filters that just filter out anything that isn't in alignment with the way that they perceive the world. Then, we've talked about cybernetics and reflexive feedback. It just becomes a reinforcing feedback loop. They harden their perceptions of the world. Their filters filter out anything that disagrees with it, so they only see things and agree with it, and it reinforces, of course, their perception of the world. You can hear it in their rhetoric. Anything they don't agree with is some far left, progressive left, extreme left, regressive left ideology, and that's about as far as the rhetoric goes. Anything I don't agree with is evil, and another synonym in the United States for evil is communist. That's about as far as I can tell it goes. So one of the tests in this paper was to ask a group of people, think of something funny to say about the following phrases, which were really conjunctions of words that you wouldn't normally associate together, like yoga bank or cereal bus. And I think gives the game away, doesn't it? Because to make a pun or a joke about yoga bank, you have to know yoga and its lingo, and yoga's quite popular with many people, and if you don't know anything about yoga to be able to form a joke about it, it means that you're not really connected to what people do. And if you can't make a joke about cereal bus, you probably don't take the bus and probably don't eat cereal. But this is what it comes down to. If you want to change society, we've got to change the way people think. This goes back to the previous episode about how vacuum pumps work. Because we give it a name to an action of doing something, sucking, and because the action is voluntary and it's a purposeful action of a human being, we misattribute the cause of water going up the pipe. Again, comes back to causality and necessary conditions. Sucking on a straw on a bowl of water in a vacuum won't work. It requires the outside pressure pushing down on that body of water. Change in perception, change in thinking. And this is why I get kind of annoyed when people say, well, I don't agree with that, as if that somehow changes physical reality or changes the facts or changes the data. Whether you agree with that or not is irrelevant. And here's that cognitive hole again. Like I mentioned in the previous audio, state A, state 1, whatever, state B, state 2, however I labelled it. I think I called it state 1, state 2. And the fact that someone had noticed that something had changed between the two states, and whatever is present during that change gets anchored in their minds as the cause, more or less as assuredly as a duckling imprints the first object it sees as its mother. Bowl of milk, straw, suck, therefore sucking causes. No other things are necessary. The incoherency is predicated on a kind of fact blindness. Bigotry, racism, prejudice seems to extend from either the ability to not see facts or the inability to be open to them, something that paper hints about. It's much like the school kid I described in the last episode who could not contemplate that there was an alternative hypothesis to his explanation, that I had stolen his snowball, which had obviously melted. It's also strange. I've noticed some people have visceral reactions to the smallest of perceived slights. I recall one time an acquaintance was selling his portable radio, long before phones had MP3 players and all that. It was quite nice. It had speakers, it had a record function, tape player, radio, all in one. I knew at the time that they were 20 quid brand new from the shop, so he was selling his second hand. I offered £10. His face scowled as though I'd slapped him across the face while dumping in his bowl of porridge. There's a serial joke. And as it happens, we were on the bus, now that I remember. Yeah, sorry for the graphic description across my friend's face, but that's really what it was like. He took great offence to it. It reminds me actually of another friend whose wife ran a dominatrix private club from a garage, and she would charge a lot of money for rich clients to be chained up overnight in nappies, and she would take a dump in their breakfast bowl. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Anyway, eventually she closed it down. All the neighbours started asking questions. Her drive was always full of expensive sports cars, Bentleys, Ferraris, and the occasional Lambo. Very awkward to explain away. Some people thought she was stealing cars. Anyway, my friend declined the £10 offer. He wanted what he'd paid for it months earlier. One doesn't always get, so I went out and bought the next model up. That ruffled him. Again, it was like the normal rules of exchange and value didn't apply to my friend. He expected top dollar when selling, but expected maximum discount when buying. There's this hint again of asymmetry, a bit of incoherence, different parts of the mind operating at different times. It's like there's no integration. It only applies to me in my world that when I buy something, I expect top discount. When I sell something, I expect top dollar for it. There's no perception that I'm now on the receiving end of someone else's offer. I don't have to accept, but I have to accept that they're at least going to make an offer. And it might not be what I expect, just like when I go into a shop and expect maximum discount. They seem unable to switch position. I assumed that people were able to do this quite naturally, and it was only when I did the early NLP courses when we formally talked about perceptual positions, first position, second position, third and fourth positions. And for all the criticism that NLP has got, and it's got a bit out of hand, it takes a lot of lessons from people who have studied linguistics. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. There's a lot of analysis of language used in persuasive techniques. So even for the education on how language works and how to create pictures in people's minds in colourful ways using modal operators and things of that nature, it's nice to give a name to a concept rather than saying, well, that thing where you imagine that you're someone else and it sounds like you are alien to the idea, but when you realise that it's such a well-studied subject, it actually has its name, Perceptual Positions. It's like, I'm glad that everyone else knows and has studied it, but it turns out that not everyone else knows about even, putting themselves in another's shoes, as it's commonly phrased. And I have to say, I've had another little guilty pleasure on the YouTubes. There's a channel that just records security footage from the back of the guy's business, and it's focused on his loading bay. And just to paint the picture, down the middle of this loading bay is a ramp. It's about 2 foot tall, and it leads directly into his warehouse. And on each side of the ramp, there are slabs of concrete, probably, well, deep enough certainly to accommodate a car and wide enough to accommodate 3 cars. So that you can imagine it's enough parking space on each side of this ramp for 3 cars. So you can get 6 cars on his rear loading bay. The signs are up. Parking for customers only. Deliveries 24/7. Do not park in this area. You will be towed if you park in this area. Release fee $150 if you park in this area. It's got about 6 signs up and lighting and cameras everywhere. It's not like you can't notice. Now, it seems like the guy can put up with people coming across his place at night and seeing it's a bit of a dark alley. They go around there and take a piss on his property, and it stinks up the place and it's not nice. He doesn't seem to mind about that. What he minds about is people clogging his deliveries. He minds about people taking up the parking space reserved for his customers. Now, he has a contract with a local towing company that patrols not just his warehouse, but the kind of community in that block, a couple of blocks around. And they have a couple of tow trucks, and they hitch it up and they cart away the cars. It takes seconds. It's an auto loader. They just back up to it, press the button, the thing comes out, lifts the car up, and off they go. That's how quick it takes. This is obviously an area of conflict, and I was quite interested to see how people react. Sometimes he goes out and warns them, saying, you can't park there, you get your car towed, and it's $150, and he gets verbal abuse for his efforts. So stop warning people. Now, the signs are there, and so when they get their cars towed, they're obviously annoyed, $150. Now, all sorts of peculiar behaviours I've noticed developed, and it's again been noticed that people develop rituals based on feedback that is sometimes erroneous and sometimes irrelevant. There was one guy who had a BMW and he parked it up and he wrote something out on a card and put it in his front windscreen. So it's like a warning or a notice or some excuse that he'd left for the tow truck company to read. Now, the security camera footage wasn't that good, so we couldn't read what it said. He was accompanied by a friend who came in another car and parked next to him at night after hours. So the tow truck comes and, as it happens, tries to take his car away, the BMW. But the BMW, this version, has a nifty handbrake system, a digital parking system that can't be disabled, which what that means is that when the tow truck comes and lifts up the rear wheels and starts to tow it, the front wheels are locked and it just drags the car across the road with the wheels locked, which damages the tyres and potentially damages the drive system. The tow truck company don't really want to pay for a new transmission on a BMW, so they left it and were going to bring a different tow truck that could lift all 4 wheels and tow it away. Meanwhile, I'm not sure of the right phrase, it's not latching because it's just full bars underneath the tyres. He disconnects the towing mechanism, reverses a little bit and picks up his friend's car and tows that away. So 45 minutes later, when the pair of them come back, she's looking for her car, it's gone. He gets into his car, says, I'll give you a lift kind of thing. So she gets into his car and he shows her the sign he's written and pointing to it. So he thinks that the sign has saved him, but the tow truck company, when they turned up, they didn't even look in the front windscreen. They just hitched up and tried to tow the car. So now he'll go away thinking this sign works. There's another episode where 2 or 3 cars parked in this loading bay. One of them was an employee car, and the tow truck company has a list of them in place so they don't tow kind of authorised vehicles. And there was a car next to it that wasn't authorised, and that one got towed. 45 minutes later or an hour later, the owner of that car came back to find his car had gone. And then he saw the signs, and it was apparent by the video footage that he was looking at the signs, and then he looked to the car to his right, realised, why hasn't that one been towed? And he seemed to think that that was awfully unfair. So he got his keys out and just scratched the hell out of this car that hadn't been towed. It's not fair that I get towed and this one doesn't, therefore he's going to suffer some damage like I have. That's the kind of mentality. As it happens, that's got a long story to it. 6 months later, the guy actually, for various reasons, well, let me tell the full story. I'll tell the abridged version. The security camera footage was good enough to get his registration plate. The YouTube channel actually named and shamed this guy because the police investigated, but they said that the video footage wasn't good enough to get a clear picture of his face. But this guy drove up in this car, they had the registration number, they went to his house, he denied it all, said it was someone else driving, it kind of broke down there, that kind of thing. Anyway, the owner of the business, quite perhaps a little bit naughty, and perhaps illegally actually doxed him on their YouTube channel, saying, the guy, this is the guy, this is who it's registered to, and this is his address. A bit naughty. Anyway, it turns out that this guy, months later, went for another job. Now it seems common practice that when you apply for a job, people Google your name, and this came up top of Google search results to this video of him keying somebody else's car, and it was a problem for him. So months later, he actually went back to the place and said, look, you really need to take that video down, it's causing me problems. And they said, well, did you do it? Because, it kind of like sounds like you're admitting that it was you. Yeah, okay, it was me, he confessed, and then said, I'll make good for the owner of the car, or organise. He got it resprayed and paid damages, settled it privately, but there you go. And then there was another case where, again, someone had parked up in this place. The owner came out, said you can't park there. They got a little bit in his face. They were big guys, telling him mind his own business. Well, this is my business. And he said, I felt a little bit intimidated by them, so I just went back inside and they wandered off. And so he came out with a red sticker and slapped it on the side window, saying, warning, if you keep this car parked here, you'll be liable to be towed. Sometime later, they returned to the vehicle, saw the sticker, got pissed off because they couldn't peel it off. It wasn't an easy peel sticker. But they started to scrape it off with a credit card, and then rather than just dispose of the sticker, they started sticking parts of it on the car that was parked next to them. It's just, petty revenge. And then we get the entrepreneurs. So this channel got popular, and it seems some of the locals had seen it and knew where it was, and being entrepreneurial, they went to the location, in the social hours, 7, 8 o'clock in the evening, when people go out to dinner and restaurants and do all those stuff. So this one chap turned up there in a high-vis vest and a cap. He pretended to be the parking attendant, charging people $20, directed them to this space in the guy's loading bay, and said, yeah, I'm here, I'm an authorised representative, so your car is now authorised to park here, you'll be fine. So he gets 6 cars in, $120, and then just fucks off for the night. Of course, tow truck turns up. It's not a legitimate arrangement. Tows all the cars. What a scam. I don't know how I feel about all this. It's such a pleasure, I have to say, when I used to drive around London, to be able to drive into town, have a parking space right outside the restaurant, park up, go in, have a good meal, come out, cars unmolested, and drive off. That is just such a wonderful experience. Rare is that case. Normally it's, driving around here, driving around there, congestion charge, parking meters, you've only got half an hour or 25 minutes. It's what's the use in that? I'm here for the evening. I have to come out every half an hour and move the car. All right, you might say, you should use the train. Fine, but at the time I lived outside of London, trains stopped running after 11 o'clock. How am I going to get home? So of course I drive. Actually, now where I used to live, it was really good. There was the Gatwick Express, so it ran every half an hour, 24/7. So I could have got that at 18 quid for a 30-minute train journey. I don't know, maybe slightly cheaper than 25 quid for parking in one of those other car parks. And a 20-minute walk to wherever it was. Just a frigging nightmare. It just ruins the whole... fuck it, I'll go home. Like I've concluded, the effort is seldom worth the payoff. But, there's another way of viewing that. Of course, this is what the rich people like. It keeps a riff-raff out. If you can't afford to even park your car, you don't belong. Yeah, so again, the hint of asymmetry, a little bit of incoherence, I understand, congestion, but when it's my turn, I want it for free, everyone else must stay, I get it. So I think I'm overly sensitive to this because it seems to be the cornerstone of a fascist uprising, one rule for us, one rule for you. And those rules are not based on facts, but how we feel at any given time. It seems also how they come to the incoherent position of their enemy being both simultaneously strong and weak. When they want to agitate their following, it's about the threat of the enemy and how they wield too much power and how they are an existential threat. In the next, when they want to ingratiate themselves with their following, it's about how weak and pathetic the enemy is in comparison to us. Powerful, me, dear leader, can fight all these people, all of them I can fight. This is the one to watch for. While the argument slips us by as appearing valid, and indeed may logically be valid, the premise may be false or ambiguous. But if the argument is verbose, it might just leave enough distance from the conclusion to the premise that we forget to check and analyse the premise. Someone might make a ridiculously long argument. Let's take a recent Trump tweet. He's actually a past master at this. So Nancy Pelosi is asking for $2.4 trillion to bail out poorly run, high crime, Democrat states, money that is in no way related to COVID. We made a very generous offer of $1.6 trillion and, as usual, she is not negotiating in good faith. I am rejecting their request and looking to the future of our country. I have instructed my representatives to stop negotiating until after the election, when, immediately after I win, we will pass a major stimulus bill that focuses on hardworking Americans and small businesses. I have asked Moscow Mitch, he didn't say Moscow, I added that, not to delay, but to instead focus full time on approving my outstanding nominee to the US Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. Our economy is doing very well. The stock market is at record levels. Jobs and unemployment. Yada, yada, yada. So wherein there's the argument? It's the way it's constructed. It induces a mental overload. There's so many pieces horribly separated. It basically boils down to he thinks Pelosi is asking for a lot of money. And Trump said no. I think that's what it boils down to. Even that, it might not even be a lot of money. Who knows? Actually, now I think about it, it's just, I'm saying no, I'm stamping my feet. It's my authority, it's my show, I think is the argument he's making. Okay, so for what reason? He did say she's not negotiating in good faith. What does that mean? The mind starts to imagine what that means. Trump is supposed to be an expert negotiator, so how come bad faith negotiation is such a problem for him? Another question. And then Trump throws in the slur to Pelosi with the as usual, which has to trigger in our mind all the previous events that we either make up on the spot or imagine or have to conjure up to make sense of this sentence. I'm rejecting their request, he says. So a minute ago, in linguistics, it was about negotiation. Now, when he refuses it, he positions it as a request of him. So which is it? Is it a negotiation or is it a request? The mind now has to resolve this apparent dichotomy. And before you do, you're distracted by the phrase, looking to the future of our country, because the our snaps you out of those abstract notions, because our is more immediate. It's you and me. It's a consequence that's threatening us right now. So again, there's a shift in perceptual shape. It's a degree of importance. We have this abstract thing, negotiation or requests about some 2.4 trillion thing that's so big that mind can't get around it. I've said no, and then it snaps us back to focusing on our country. So it brings, it distracts your attention. And what does that mean anyway? It can mean so many things. So now we have to imagine the country, which is quite a big thing, and we have to imagine looking to the future of it. Well, I can imagine that in many different ways. It's almost overwhelming to think about in any kind of realistic sense. So it takes quite a bit of brain power to even get your head around the possibilities of what that could mean. But there's more. He says he's instructed his reps, which again is to infer he's in charge. It's not I've discussed it with people and we feel that there is an argument here to be made for this, that and the other. It's just no, I'm in charge. I've told people to go and do this thing. It's all his doing. He's the only one doing this, and he's the one barking orders, in this case, to stop negotiating. So it is a negotiation, not a request. I don't know, maybe. And then he says immediately after the election, which he will win. Again, you have to make a picture of that in your mind to make sense of the statement. So, just as an experiment, don't think of him riding an elephant with an American flag while in his boxer shorts doing that down Fifth Avenue. I said, don't think of that. Oh, never mind. Then he goes on to say something about stimulus bill after the election. Stimulus bill and hardworking Americans, small businesses, more mental noise. But what's in the bill is not actually stated, but we were instead misdirected to the future, post-election victories. Did he actually say how much money he was pledging for the future bill? No, he didn't. And this is how to kind of fool those who don't know what an argument is. He then went on about something to do with Supreme Court and nomination for this, and Amy Coney Barrett that, more detail in here, the distraction clause, the stock market, record levels. He doesn't state what they are, by the way, but record low could be one interpretation. But let's go with the assumed meaning of record high. So to make sense of that clause, you have to recall the last time you looked at the Dow Jones or the Nasdaq and remember what the levels it was at, and then now imagine that it's even more than that, so you better make sense of it. Can you remember what the Dow was last time you looked? You have to be able to imagine that the stock market is now even higher than that. See, the cognitive demands are piling up, and it becomes overwhelming at a point where you say, enough's enough, but we're not done. Jobs and unemployment also coming back in record numbers, he said. We are leading the world in economic recovery, and the best is yet to come, whatever that means. So how much was Pelosi asking for, and for why? And what was the reasons that Pelosi was denied? What was the substantive reason? Well, the reason isn't disclosed. The reason, I suspect, is self-serving, of course. And it seems Trump either knows this and knows enough not to disclose the reason, or it's his modus operandi to instinctively blame others and just distract, and that's all he does. It's just his default mode of operation. The reason, at this time of recording, and it's now 4 weeks to the election, and Trump is way behind in the polls. Way behind. So he makes this edict proclamation by tweet to a starving and desperate population that he's refusing to hear out any argument that would support the $2.4 trillion relief fund. That's quite a remarkable thing to do. And he's blamed the Democrats and Pelosi as being unreasonable or acting in bad faith. So this money, to clarify, works out, I think, about $1,200 per person. I don't know what that is divided by 3 months since the last one or whatever it was. It's not a lot, is it? So all the previous points, all the little points are highlighted, amounts to little more than bickering or technicalities or arguing over red herrings and distractions, but I wanted to point it out because it's so easy to get distracted and overloaded and trying to answer all those before getting back to the core issue. What is the principle? What is the principal action that's being taken? Trump has delayed the stimulus package for another month at least. And I suspect the reason is to conjure a magic trick that paints the false picture that it's the Democrats who are delaying the stimulus package. And therefore, the electorate ought to punish them for this hold-up. But it's not them. They're ready to go. He himself has said he's stopped negotiating. Or, when they made the request, whichever it is. However, the plot thickens. And there's some other issues in there, of course, and one of them is the airlines being included in this package. I think it's a bargaining chip that can be leveraged. Anyhow, I didn't want to get too specific into politics with specific events. This will all have changed or have been resolved by the time this video gets onto YouTube. We colloquially think of an argument as a dispute or a falling out. So here's a shocking example. Guns are dangerous, therefore we ought to ban them. When asked if this was an argument, some respondents said, no, it's not an argument because I agree with it. To be clear, the premise is a bit shaky and the conclusion is probably shaky too. However, this is indicative of what seems to be a common error in thinking. I think I've made my views on guns clear in other videos. It depends, and that's another story. But again, there's a confusion between an argument and a quarrel. Likewise, Trump's tweets are quarrels. There's no substantive argument in them, and this is a problem with Twitter. Only so many words. Trump's tweets carry so many phrases and leading statements that many people might agree with at face value, and as such will just agree on balance with the entire statement. It's the yes, yes, yes chain. In this case, he says that he's refusing the funding, doesn't say why, then makes other statements. And if you're a supporter, yes, I agree with that bit. He makes another statement, yes, I also agree with that bit. And then he makes another statement, yes, I hope that is true too. And then he makes another statement, yes, I also agree with that. And he may stretch to future possibilities which we hope will come true, or it could conceivably be true. Now, what was the reason he turned down funding? Doesn't matter. We have so many other points that we, his fans, would agree with. We know his fans, not us necessarily, know he's right in what he says in 7 out of the 8 points. If not, there's a mountain of shit we have to move before we get to the original burning question. It's very much like that bag of shit that someone set on fire on your doorstep. When you open the door and see your bag on fire, you might just stamp on it to put it out. And, by the way, immediately after Trump's tweet, the stock market dropped almost 1,000 points on the Dow Jones, which is about 5%. Quite remarkable. Obviously, it sprung back the next day or so. I was with a trader once at Citigroup who bought £200 million worth of stock at 4 p.m. on a Friday, and it blipped the FTSE 100 200 points north. He got a call from the exchange about that. Not supposed to do that, but because it was all client orders, it kind of had an excuse, can't not fulfill client orders. Because what happens on Monday morning is when those orders are kind of absorbed into the market, within the first few minutes, the index will revert to its mean, i.e. drop 200 points. And on an opening Monday morning of a FTSE dropping 200 points, people take note of that kind of thing. Friday, where it artificially went up 200 points, is long forgotten. Everyone now wants to know why the FTSE's dropped 200 points in the first 15 minutes of trading on Monday morning, what happened, what's going on, and it creates hesitation and pause, creates unnecessary volatility. A lot of people read into that all sorts of things. Just like our friend in the loading bay who wrote the notice and left it in the front of his BMW. He'll take that as a sign. But really, we have to remember that these indexes are the composites indexes. They are composites of the largest and most valuable companies, with the largest market cap, I think, possibly. Companies come, companies grow, companies die, but the index remains. It's like that chart in our previous video that showed that 21 people doing poor thinking, when asked a question on the probability of their death next year, they reasoned they would be alive or dead and hence put the odds at 50-50. Almost by definition, the stock market always goes up. Think about it. A new company gets listed on the exchange, grows in size, becomes profitable, does a few mergers, buys out a few things, gets favourable loans. They're the poster child of the month, and it makes its way into the index and it grows, and it itself lifts the index. Then, sometimes later, efficiencies in the markets are normalised, competition erodes their advantage, they're over-leveraged, and it's seen as just a debt-laden company. The share price falls, the market cap goes down, they get delisted, and a new company has now taken its place, even bigger, with an even larger market cap, with even more debt, and naturally lifts the index. And since the index is limited to the top 100 or top 500 or whatever it is, the new kid on the block displaces those below it. More than half of the companies that were listed on the FTSE 100 index since the peak of 1999 are no longer on it. Some have merged, some have been taken over, and what remains are companies that actually have very little semblance to ordinary and everyday life for the average citizen, though they likely touch them in many ways. Big pharma, big banking, so we all take medicines and buy painkillers. We all need retail banking, but most of us don't touch investment or mercantile banking. But as far as we go is an overdraft and a mortgage, maybe a car loan. Then there's the set we've talked about, the common informal logical fallacies, straw man, where someone misrepresents another's position and then beats that misrepresented position. The Texas sharpshooting fallacy. This is where somebody draws your attention to a cluster of data points and says, look, see, it proves the point. But the fallacy, if you can imagine a Texan sharpshooter just shooting bullets randomly into the side of a shed, and suppose it's a crap shot and he's been shooting bullets all day, you might imagine eventually somewhere on the side of the barn a cluster of bullet holes will form, and then at the end of the day he goes up to that cluster and draws a circle around it and says, see, look what a good shot I am, and got all those in within the white circle I just drew. And then there's the black and white fallacy, it must be this or that, no room for nuance, slippery slope arguments. There's hundreds, look them up on the internet or go into the Facebook group, hundreds of them. I must admit, it was a relief to me that these errors in arguments had names. I struggled for years to describe why an argument seemed somehow internally inconsistent, and it took such a long time to describe why I started to not bother, and I just kind of stopped listening to people who seemed always to use these language constructs. I knew I was being had or fleeced with this kind of thinking, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I knew that it didn't make logical sense, but it was only when I realised it happens so often, and it happens in well-defined and well-known ways, that we have all these names for them. I'm sure you must have seen on the internet the poster, No Thy Logical Fallacies. I think it lists about 20 or 30 of the more popular ones. And the ad hominem as well, particularly the nasty one. This is where you try and discredit someone's argument by calling them stupid or inept, or that they are in some way reduced, and so you attack their identity, you attack their personality, but you're attacking everything except their argument. So what? Also, sometimes while premise or the premises can be false, the conclusion, though not for the reason of logic or the argument it contains, can be true. So it can be a correct claim for all the wrong reasons. So it would also be an error to conclude that the conclusion of an argument has to be wrong if it contains a faulty premise or flawed logic. Sometimes it can contain flawed premise and flawed logic, yet the resultant claim just so happens to be true. In this situation, we can say that the conclusion is not supported or does not follow from the premise of the logic, and therefore the argument doesn't hold up. The claim or the conclusion may still be true. So I thought to do a quick recap on arguments, and we covered this visually in episode 11 and mentioned throughout the channel empathy, which I think I'm all about, critical perspective, attention to linguistics, detecting and handling ambiguities, which I think was covered in the motivational interviewing series, and something I find tricky myself, balancing the strong and weak points in arguments. I've mentioned before the deductive has a certainty about it. The more generalised and probabilistic inductive has more vagueness about it. I like the tools to discern. Then, of course, there is the data, facts, evidence we can examine, and the logical conclusion of where that leads. I'm much more comfortable handling that kind of investigation. I'll also make mention that so-called good faith arguments or claims, such as those made generally in published papers of repute, set out everything for examination. It's almost an invitation for others to critique and find flaw, and the paper sets out things to help this happen in the fastest and lowest friction way possible. They don't hide stuff. They don't lay gotcha traps. They don't use sneaky linguistics or convoluted language or ambiguous statements or emotional rhetoric to disguise and distract. If anything, an effort is made to do the exact opposite. Perhaps again, different types of argument for different occasions. And if I remember, towards the end of this series, I've got about, 30 more videos planned to do. After the bit on war, I might do a little bit of an intro to artificial intelligence and how this field is sitting between, say, argumentation, which is kind of described as informal logic, and the pure logic of the ones and zeros that machines use to do what they do. And in between this is the kind of quasi-semi-formal logic of machine learning. In the previous video, we mentioned that context matters in argumentation. There is an often cited example from Levinson. Person A, I have a 14-year-old son. Person B, well, that's all right. Person A, I also have a dog. Person B, oh, I'm sorry. Without context, it's difficult to make sense, and human nature is to grant the benefit of the doubt. Here again, I refer back to the mad ramblings of Trump. Of course, if the fuller context is made available, it makes sense. In Trump's case, also, he's got the reverence of office on his side. No one likes to tell him to shut up. Except Joe Biden. Nice one, Joe. But in the case of Levinson, the conversation was, of course, about an apartment rental. Now it makes sense. Without providing the context, it's difficult to understand what it's all about. The mind gets overloaded. What could all this be? But if the person offering that as an argument really wanted the other person to understand, of course they'd add the context. With deliberately withholding the context, it's got to be tantamount to a lie. So I wonder as well, when McNanny said, "I'll never lie to you," I wonder if she included in that lies by omission. Dialogue then requires the cooperation of the parties to fulfil the goals. I think it gets a bit tricky when each party has different goals. Sometimes this is actually okay as long as the participants are willing to help each other reach that goal. It falls out when one will not participate. Oh, is Trump dropping out of the debate on a second debate? At the time of recording, this is kind of breaking news. Who knows what it's going to do? Kind of dates this audio. I don't know whether it's going to be around for another 7 days. I don't know if this COVID's going to come back and bite him. Anyway, yeah, it falls out when one will not participate. And the example, pertinent I suppose, is where one just wants to enjoy humiliating the other. And under these circumstances, I can hardly blame the other for not willing to participate in such a thing. However, underneath both of those cases, there are unmet needs. The first seems to have a need to win and dominate, or have something fulfilled by winning and dominating. The other one has a need not to be humiliated, to have a certain respect and dignity afforded them. You've seen this, I'm sure. One party is interested in owning the other, or just to feel good by telling the other to sit down and shut up. I've heard this one a few times, and it suggests to me that this is how they were spoken to by their parents when they were little. It's also a note when people get angry or highly stressed that they do seem to act out an exaggerated form of their parental modelled behaviours. You can listen to many a scam caller that's been trolled by the scam baiters. Plenty of videos on YouTube, and when the scammer reaches the limit of them being teased, it all comes out. Anger, then contempt, and then threats of violence. It's kind of predictable. The violence over the phone is usually in the form of insults, ill wishes, and prescriptions for self-fornication, and telling people to shut up or that they're stupid. You've heard it all before, I'm sure. Occasionally thrown in with a good rant of, listen to me, I am telling you, you will do, it's just devolves into a desperate recalled behaviour, and I'm sure, as I say, it's them reenacting how their parents were with them. I think we've done the Kubler-Ross model to death, haven't we? And we've done the choosing beggars model to death. It seems to play out in real life. We've said things about those before. And we've also mentioned on the channel cross-purposes interlocutors engage with in discussions and arguments. So recall that sometimes one person is arguing for something good, but has the understanding that good here means logical or true, or even pleasing to the eye. The scope is actually wider. So, consider kind of the classic, if you like, divorce. Is this a settlement? Is it a negotiation? Is it a quarrel? Or is it an act of persuasion when it comes to who gets what? And in that also, who gets to keep particular obligations? If the question is phrased, who gets the kids, it frames it as a competition, a prize to win, I presume. If it's framed as an investigation to find out which party is best suited to look after the children, it moves to a persuasion-style dialogue. It widens the frame. As we mentioned early in this series, boundaries, borders, what data or information are included in our survey set or in our sample set, what's being included in the analysis, what's being kept out of the analysis, and as it was highlighted in the previous video, in respect of argument pathways, and as we're saying here, the context matters. What are the known limits of the model? Which model are we choosing? Or which is the simplest for our purpose? Which models actually serve our purpose? So we can add to the list of the aesthetic good, the logical facts of the matter, the truth, and the moralistic right and wrongs. We can add different aspects of argument dialogue, persuasion, inquiry, negotiation, educational dialogue, and even debates. And again, there's different kinds of debate. There's ones seeking information, there's ones to win the debate, to be a perceived winner, and there's different strategies, and, it depends what you're going for. Again, it depends what the intent is, what outcome you want, and which model to select, whether you are having a debate to further people's learning and participation, or whether you're just coming out to win, in which case truth doesn't matter so much. It's just all rhetoric. So I think it's, a lot of this now, it sort of gets relativistic. Ask the question, are you a good communicator? No, I say. Yet at the same time, hopefully we can appreciate that in knowing these different frames and that different rules and objectives are apparent within each frame, we have elevated our communication ability. And insofar as we now know how little we knew before about this, we can now at least have a starting point to try and understand the different models and the different rules and the different outcomes of selecting those models. We know what the limits are of each model. That is to say, it's no good arguing from aesthetics when the other person is trying to find out the logical consequences. It's just a mismatch. We know that that model of argumentation is not appropriate for the outcome that we're trying to go for. Of course, I can only speak for myself in terms of how much I didn't know. But experience has shown that many who've claimed to be good communicators don't know about linguistics, modal operators, different argumentation styles, and what the Socratic method is, nor much about logos, pathos, teleos, whatever the fuck it is. And they think that negotiation is nothing more than brinkmanship bargaining. And often I've actually seen the other side somewhat capitulate, not because of this tactic, but more often in spite of it. Counterparty recognises that the basement bargainer will cut off their nose to spite their face, and this might actually end up in the first party bankrupting their own company and putting people out of work. So the counterparty actually takes a responsible stance and realises this guy's just a lunatic. He's going to fold his company through brinkmanship. So let's at least throw him a bone and keep his staff employed. So we're not doing it for him. We're keeping his company afloat. He doesn't realise that, of course. Another word for it is a sympathy fuck. And then the guy goes off thinking he's some great negotiator, just like the guy in the BMW who didn't get towed because he left a cute note in the windscreen that no one actually read. If there's one of the logical fallacies that really gets on my tits, it's denying the antecedent. It's so grifty. It goes like this. Citizens who support the country's war effort are patriotic citizens. Yay, nationalism, jingoism. Therefore, those who don't support the war are not patriotic. See, it's got a good slice of black and white thinking in there. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Only a Sith Lord thinks in... Yeah, we've already done that one. Or, as recently expressed in Trump's 4th of July rhetoric, well, let's call it an address anyway, it was hardly a speech, where he inferred that protesters were not Americans. And if they're not Americans, then what are they? Well, they're other. I don't know, fill in the gap. What? Immigrants? Illegal aliens? And then it's easy to bolt onto that a policy of punishing the non-patriotic non-citizens and those who are not American, and indeed putting a 10-year prison sentence on anyone who defaces a lump of rock that happens to be chiselled to resemble some mythical caricature of a person from the past. Crime, reframed as denigrating history, but it's denigrating an icon, it's denigrating a lump of rock. Well, history is what history is. And often the truth is that the statue itself is often a symbol of a fantasy, a myth, a device of character rehabilitation. So, this kind of tactic, this denying the antecedent, is particularly shitty because citizens who are patriotic but might not support an unjust war, if ever there is a just war, now have to fight the unjust punishment and explain a logical fallacy in their defence before even getting back to expressing their arguments for not supporting a war effort. They have 3 times the work to do ahead of them now. And the trouble is, dishonest people have no qualms about asking malformed, leading, disingenuous questions, casting aspersions, disparaging experts in the field. It's all well explained actually in a documentary called The Merchants of Doubt. It's worth a watch. It's pretty reprehensible behaviour that goes on. So the point I'm trying to get to in a rather long-winded way, and I apologise for that, is that there are some people who just want to get their own way and will say and do anything to get it. They use a rhetoric or a veneer of civility that sounds reasonable, but it's just casting aspersions, smearing other people, besmirching anyone with good ideas, using this rhetoric of division. And then there's another set of people who ask questions whereby they are actually seeking genuine answers, that they are on a quest to actually know and understand about the world, and that they want to try and evaluate that or fit it into their model of how to behave so that they can make the world a better place. There seems to be some consequentialism about it. Whereas the former, they're just out for themselves. It's just, I want to do this. And, if you show reasons or causality or science that contradicts it, well, you're obviously one of them. You're not patriotic because you don't support American industry. You're just a Ramona, despite the fact that Brexit has imposed economic sanctions on its own country. That's demonstrably true. But no, it doesn't matter because, you're just a Ramona. So there's two kinds of argumentation style going on here, which is really what I'm trying to draw out. And fighting one with the other isn't always going to work. The case that I remember from the documentary is where there's a communication expert or specialist that's hired by lobby groups to denigrate scientists. And he says that he will say something like, these scientists think they know it all, and they don't realise the implications of their policies on hard-working Americans, that's going to take so much from these hard-working Americans, and it's almost, but not quite, a disgraceful imposition, and I would hate to see anything bad happen to these scientists, and I'm not advocating violent intentions towards these scientists. By the way, this is where they work, this is the address of their lab, and here's their hometown, but all I am saying is it would be nice to see justice served on these people. Is all but advocating to go around there and give them a good kicking is what he's doing. And then you get 2 or 3 scientists that have reported their findings, certainly barraged by 2 million tweets, 100,000 letter campaigns, and 50 campers outside their garage in the morning, all wanting to fuck them up for whatever reason. And, at the time of recording, not necessarily the time of writing, that was months ago, and this is going to date the audio, right here, the breaking news story of the evening is how the FBI has busted the militia plot to abduct Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. This is a consequence of this dangerous rhetoric. Eventually, one of them is going to go and do it. I mean, we know they do it. As the Merchants of Doubt documentary showed, people get enraged and they do turn up at the labs. They do physically abuse people. They, what's the expression, paper terrorist, where they constantly send things through the post, harass and intimidate, stalk. It just makes life unpleasant, and we've seen how pacey people can be with the examples from the car towing, where people are parking in the guy's warehouse delivery area. They'll take stickers off their car and put it on others. They'll damage other people's cars that weren't towed because they feel that the other person got away with something that they didn't. Again, it's this relative privation thing. And this news about the FBI busting the so-called militia, or American Taliban, as I like to call them, all about what? Face masks. Oh, did the nasty lady tell you got to wear a face mask? Oh. Fucking snowflakes. See what I mean about the incoherence? These guys are dressed up in 20 grand's worth of military outfit. They got the helmets, the visors, the bulletproof cladding, the army get-up, the boots and the rifles and the ammo, and they march on City Hall to try and abduct someone. So they're pretending on one hand to be big, mean and tough, and on the other hand it's because they got to wear face masks. And one more specific fallacious use of rhetoric that really gets me pissed off, I've covered it in the Facebook group, it's the guilt by association. And here's like an inverse of guilt by association. So it goes, all cats are cute, all dogs are cute, therefore all cats are dogs. Because they share a similar attribute, therefore they must be the same. And you'd think that's ridiculous. Well, let me try this on you. You see it online and in political debates. Group A makes a claim about this or the other. Group B, which is seen in a dim light for whatever reason, also happens to make a similar claim, coincidentally. This dim light is therefore transferred to Group A. Hey, Group A, you say the same thing as that awful Group B. You're just like them. And the more sophisticated, but cornerstone for conspiracy theorists is the Galileo Gambit. And don't get me started on Pascal's wage. Fucking horrible things these are. So, quoting, I think, from Wikipedia, a form of the association fallacy often used by those denying a well-established scientific or historical proposition is the so-called Galileo Gambit. The argument goes that since Galileo was ridiculed in his time, but later acknowledged to be right, that since their non-mainstream views are provoking ridicule and rejection from other scientists, they therefore will be later recognised as correct too. The Galileo Gambit is flawed in that being ridiculed does not necessarily correlate with being right, and that many people who have been ridiculed in history were wrong. And as an addendum to the note on Wikipedia, it says that similarly Carl Sagan has stated that while they laughed at Columbus and the Wright brothers, they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. it should be noted that a current conspiracy theorist, and I refuse to say his name, the one who's talking about 5G being deadly or whatever, and that coronavirus is a hoax, the shape-shifting lizard guy, he uses this argument a lot. First they ignore you, then they try to laugh at you, and only later then will they accept the truth. It's just bollocks. Advertising as well usually plays on words a lot, so many examples to choose from. Kills 98% of all known germs, which is exactly the same amount that the competition's bleach kills. No added sugar. Yeah, already has enough natural sugar in it. Too much. And we'll have a look at the episode from probably about 9 months, 10 months ago, depending on when you watch this, of course. Mad Muscle Supplements. I did a whole episode on the borderline between being legal advertising and illegal advertising concerning supplements, and the claims that you can and can't make, and how to make claims that are actually vacuous that sound really good. Plenty of examples of meaningless claims. Of course, Carlsberg famous for poking fun at this, probably. And then there's the evergreen lasts longer than what? And then there's inferred claims about product quality or origin, hidden fees and puffery, some of which is illegal. It's a great area of study. People study these things. People seem to study everything. It's quite fascinating what people get up to. So here's a little diagram on the screen showing the taxonomy of rhetorical figures in advertising. So it's talking about, or it's showing artful deviations, and then the kind of nomenclature used to describe what type of, I don't know, it's not artful use of language. And really down on the third level there, we've got the rhetorical operation of repetition, reversal, substitution and destabilization. And then within those subcategories, rhyme, time, alliteration, anaphoria, epistrophe. You can say the other two as yourself. On the right hand side, hyperbole, ellipsis, rhetorical questions, metonyms, metaphor, pun, irony and paradox. So I suppose we should do a few examples. So a rhyme, think of any rhyme in advertising. KitchenAid, for the way it's made. So this is where you use a repetition of syllables at the end of words. Chime is keywords in a phrase that begin with identical sound or letters. Alliteration is where you repeat sounds or words. So-and-so makes a real fast, mean, lean, real cuisine, that kind of thing. Anaphoria is repetition of words at the beginning of phrases. Early to bed, early to rise. Early treatment, early cure, that kind of thing. And then epistrophe is the same, but at the end, smartphone smarts. Do your best, be the best. Anadiplosis, I think, is similar, whereas it's a repeating sound at the end of the first statement and the beginning of the second. So that'd be something like ice cool, cool as ice. And then reversals, several different syntaxes to pull these into. Ron Seal, how does that go? Says what it does what it says, that kind of thing. And then we have antithesis syntax, where instead of the same, it's opposites. So that would be easy on your fabrics, tough on stains, something like that. Then hyperbole, making vacuous, exaggerated claims that are largely meaningless when you think about it. Speakers that sound so clear, you can feel it. Rhetorical questions, again, you have to process the statement to make sense of it, to be able to answer the question. So, are you only using 10% of your brain? What would happen if you used 100%? That kind of thing. Don't you have something better to hope for in life? That kind of thing. What else have we got? Ellipsis kind of reminds me of, it's a ... an inference that's made but not stated. So with the Stella Artois, remember that one? Reassuringly expensive ... because it's high quality. Could say a lot of other beers cost less than a Grolsch. That's because they should ... inferring lesser quality. A metonym, I'll have to look up synecdoche again, because I think it's like a synecdoche, but I know that doesn't help unless you know what a synecdoche is. But it's like a word that's associated with the thing that you're talking about, but it's substituted in. When we're talking about, say, UK and the government and the civil service, we might refer to Westminster. If we're talking about something the Prime Minister said, we might say 10 Downing Street issued a statement earlier. So it's like a stand-in. The Pentagon, I think, is an example of a synecdoche. I've just looked it up on Wikipedia. Synecdoche is a class of metonymy. often by means of either mentioning a part of the whole or conversely the whole for one of its parts. So examples include suits for businessmen, boots for soldiers, America for the United States, the Pentagon for the United States Department of Defense. Puns, I'm sure I don't have to cover that one off. Homonyms, we mentioned ad hominem attack earlier. Homonym is where you can introduce a dual ambiguous meaning. So like you can say, if you're going to buy a fast motorcycle, the advertiser might say, so-and-so motorcycles, make fun of the road. Is that because it goes fast and you can take the piss? Or is it because it actually makes the activity itself fun on the road? Antanaclasis is where a word or phrase is repeated, I think within the same sentence, but where that word or phrase has a very different meaning. The famous example is from Benjamin Franklin, who said, "We all must hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." Paradox, I'm pretty sure we all know what that is. Irony, same. And so there's an arrow here saying from the left to the right is kind of like a gradient of deviation. When we use irony, we're actually stating the exact opposite of what we mean, but it's understood that the listener is sophisticated enough to know that. Sometimes on the internet we run into trouble with something called Poe's law, where the parody or the mocking of something that's so ridiculous is itself so ridiculous as to be indistinguishable from the actual ridiculousness of the original claim. And then some people go around believing the parody because it's indistinguishable from the outrageous and stupid original claim. Whereas on the left-hand side with repetition, time and alliteration, we are more forthright in what we're saying. It's not too different from the actual meaning we're trying to convey. So we might repeat words, but the words are very close to the meaning we convey, whereas irony and paradox, the meaning is almost the exact opposite of the written word. Another word for the divergence, think of it more like congruence or incongruency. So yeah, it's just something else to be alert to, and they're not necessarily bad arguments, but they are rhetorical devices. It's far easier to get somebody converted or persuaded using rhetoric and emotion than the painful, drawn-out process of experiment, hypothesis testing, statistical significance tests, comparing the null hypothesis to the alternative hypothesis, working out odds and stats, and then communicating that in a logical fashion that people will hopefully understand, but mostly they won't. Which brings us to keep in mind the source of the claims. Obviously, product advertisers and their own marketing labs or research departments have conflicts of interest. Bear that in mind. News media has endless loops. Paper A quotes Paper B that quotes Paper C that got it from blogger XYZ that got it from Paper A. It's not a false claim to say blah de blah de blah says other newspaper or says reporter. They may well have said that, and they could be wrong in what they said, but it is true to say that they said it. It's poor reporting. Investigative journalism used to be a valuable tool because it made sense of the world. It gave a substantiated explanation of what was going on, rather than just say, somebody else says this is going on. Okay, great. Well, what's the credentials of that other person? Were they there at the time? What did they see? And what did they experience? This kind of lazy journalism, just quoting other reporters, is just, well, it's Kant's clock all over again. Well, at least they give you a chance by citing sources, I suppose, not something that woo-woo crowd, oh, fuck the woo-woo clan. No sources, so we can't verify their claims. And on this basis, the claims should be held as highly suspect and provisional at best. Further, woo-woo claims are nebulous, something about energy and vibration and higher consciousness. In other words, the claims are so vague it's questionable whether they're really claiming anything at all. And that's why I went into the little bit about the taxonomy of rhetoric, logical fallacies. Once you see it once, you kind of get the gist of the woo-woo peddler. All this, it's all building up to something. The whole series, this whole 5 or 6 hour long audio, how long it's going to be, it all comes together at the end, so bear with. Woo-woo peddlers, sometimes I like to play with them online or on LinkedIn. Used to ask them questions, but you get a deluge of shit back. It's like asking a young child, hey, when you turn the lights out at bedtime, where does the light go? They'll come up with an answer. Hey, woo-woo peddler, when you go to sleep, where does consciousness go? They will come up with an answer. And when you wake up, from where did consciousness return? By what means of transit? Well, many scientists agree that it's not an answer, as many scientists may be in unrelated fields and might be expressing a personal opinion outside of their area of expertise. Yeah, fucking anti-vaxxers with your chiropractors and promoting computer programmers who have nothing to do with epidemiology or biology, yet somehow chiropractors and computer scientists are listed as signatories on these documents as domain experts or scientists, when they're not, nothing to do with it, no further qualified than you or I. Yeah, so computer programmers are not scientists for 99.9% of the case. Chiropractors, even within their own field, are split as to which school of chiropractic they adhere to. That puts them at odds with each other. I've seen good results with one or two, but they're not the ones making claims about subluxations and blocked energy fields. And they're certainly not strapping up people's heads in elaborate straps and braces and then yanking them just for the cracks and views on YouTube. I've seen some horrendous stuff. They're going to get someone killed. They already have. There was a case in the UK, I think in Leicester, a pretty horrible case. It's quackery, plain and simple. Though, as I say, I've seen one or two get good results. I don't even know whether they would call themselves chiropractic anymore. So I've seen in recent days claims that 150 scientists agree that COVID this or COVID that. And so I have to be at least consistent in my approach and ask, in what way do they agree? That 150 scientists have independent labs from each other and they've independently done their own experiments and independently reached similar conclusions? In that case, that's significant. But if someone's done a survey, asked scientists not in the domain of epidemiology or virology, hey, do you think this or the other? Tick the box. If that's what they mean by scientists, then you can almost dismiss it, I suppose. Again, surveys don't really paint any useful information to do with causation. And then the statistics. Fuck. So we mentioned about sampling. I guess my tits, because it's quite a powerful tool. It's not well understood. It's quite tricky. And people, statistics, lies, and damn lies, and then statistics. And you can say anything with statistics. Well, you can if you don't know what you're doing. And that's the point. People who don't know what they're doing do use statistics to say all sorts of shit. It's like the English language, when people use loose and fast language, and then someone will complain that they've used a made-up word. Well, all words are made up. It's like, you can make any claim in the English language. Why do we not then say, well, you can say anything with language? Yeah, of course you can. Of course you can. Doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean it logically follows. Doesn't mean that it's supported in premise or evidence. Same with stats. You've got to know what you're doing. By the way, that original Andrew Wakefield study, the one that kicked off that whole fucking anti-vax thing, was based on something like 12 children. That was it, 12 kids. And if I recall, they weren't exactly informed as to what was going on, so it was an unethical study as well as everything else. Let's just leave that one where it is. But there was a Danish study of more than 500,000 children, and it showed no link between the MMR vaccination and autism. Yet the myth persists. 500,000 shows no link. 12 kids in an unethical experiment. Oh, well, that's got to be the one then, hasn't it? How does that kind of statistic work? Yeah, so you can look it up. The paper's called A Population-Based Study of Measles, Mumps and Rubella Vaccination and Autism. DOI 10.1056/NEJ MOA 02-1134. Which is the New England Journal of Medicine. So if you look into that study, 500,000 kids, and that was almost a complete census of the population concerned. So sometimes I wonder, how many times do we have to go to the moon? How many times do we have to put another satellite in space to show it ain't fucking flat? Some people, it seems, either can't or won't change their minds, no matter what, no matter the evidence. I mean, it's even being asked, what evidence could I show you that would change your mind? None. Well, then there's no point in having a conversation, because if there's no evidence you're going to accept, then you're just never going to change your mind. Yet seem persuaded by a study done 20, 30 years ago on 12 kids that was unethical. They'll put their entire faith in that, but then they'll come back and say, well, you're just not open to an alternative point of view, are you? Oh, fuck off. So anyway, having got that off my chest, it's clear there's two types of analysis we can do. Quantitative which means show me the numbers. And this has an exactitude. We can know what more or better is by looking at the specific numbers. They're kind of in investment banking and finance. These analysts are called quants, quantitative analysis. And then we have qualitative. So this is the whiny, pissy verbal description. I shouldn't say that. I have difficulty with this one. Yeah, it's valid. Of course it's valid. I mean, would you buy an item that's described as heavy? Depends if it's a backpack or a diamond ring, innit? And it seems that being thick, double C, thick, is in vogue at the moment. So, context. And that's the thing about qualitative context. Quantitative analysis yields us a definitive answers to questions we might like to know. Calculus, maths, solving optimization problems, simplex methods, as described in the video way back on decisions. Yeah, it's the world of the mathematician and the tools they develop that help physicists and engineers and chemists and biologists and, well, so on. A quick word on taxonomy, that old can of worms, taxonomy of life. And chemistry, from what I understand, recently underwent a nomenclature change not too long ago. I mean, yeah, respect to chemists, they really do have to have good memories, that's for sure. Oh boy, I think that's why I like physics, because you could pretty much work it all out from first principles, and a good experiment. But chemistry stuff, fucking hell, the categorizations and the names of things and how it all bolted on, it was just heavy. I find it heavy anyway. Yeah, and biologists, they've got a knack for complicated sounding words and all that Latin descriptions and classifications and taxonomy of things. Didn't really do too much taxonomy in physics. So what makes a species, and are there subspecies, and what about those in the middle? Is it dog-bear or bear-dog? When we come to talking about transitional forms, the one we all learn about in school is Archaeopteryx. Is the classification based on morphology, environment, or genetics? And if it's morphology, we're kind of stuck with that problem. Is it a bear-dog or a dog-bear? It's kind of in the middle. Is it a bird, or is it a reptile, or is it still a dinosaur? Well, I think we've answered the questions. And I'm not one to speak on this method of classification, but I understand genetics and analysis of genetic clustering now is a consideration, with the problems mentioned before about what constitutes a change or an overlap in genetics. The quick brown fox jumped, or the quick brown fax jumped thing we did a little while ago. The organising structure for classification of life is cladistics, which accounts for evolution and something called synapomorphies. See, they don't make it easy. Even these words are freaking hard to pronounce, let alone remember. A synapomorphy is a possession by two or more organisms of a characteristic inherited exclusively from their common ancestor. The taxonomy of life is now a twin nested hierarchy. Genomic sequence comparisons overlap the original taxonomic tree of life that was based on morphology alone and provides additional evidence as to the classifications. Aha! Objective verification. Good. One telling feature of this classification is the clade nature that defines the current classification from the preceding clade. So it's a bit cause and effect. That is, for example, once a lizard, always a lizard. Even when the animal species under consideration evolves into a new species, and those evolve into a new species and so on, they can never escape their clade. They are still lizards, but with, I presume, further clade distinctions specifying the nature and type of subclades, if you like, backed up, I presume, by genetic differences. So this classification also puts the human sapiens in the superclade of Hominoidea, again with the big fucking names again, aka apes. And whatever human sapiens evolve into in the future, they will still be apes. We can't grow out of our ancestry. Oh boy. So I've been working up to this one. I haven't rehearsed it, but I got it written down. I'm going to see if I can do it in one take. Alright, here we go. This is bonkers. But this is the difference between physics and biology, and remembering all this shit and what it all means. Here we go. Primates are collectively defined as any gillless, organic, RNA, DNA, protein-based, metabolic, metazoic, nucleic, diploid, bilaterally symmetric, endothermic, digestive, tripoblast, obscurethont, no that's wrong, opisthocont, deuterostome, coleomate with a spinal cord and 12 cranial nerves connecting to a limbic system and an enlarged cerebral cortex with a reduced olfactory region inside of George's skull with a specialized teeth including canines and premolars, forward-oriented, fully enclosed optic orbits in a single temporal fenestra attached to a vertebrate hind leg dominant tetrapodal skeleton with a sacral pelvis, clavicle, and a wrist and ankle bones having lungs, tear ducts, body-wide hair follicles, lacteal mummaries, opposable thumbs, and keratinized dermis, chintineous nails on all 5 digits on all 4 extremities, in addition to an embryonic development in amniotic fluid leading to a placental birth and a highly social life. That's the definition of primate. That's what we are, that's what primates are. And additional specification delineates our specificity from other primates. Each of those terms has its specificity. So yeah, qualitatively can be verbose, but gets the job done. Specificity, precision, and accuracy. A quick note. Context matters. So we have things like food tables and recommended daily allowances, nutritional information, and then food manufacturers state on their packaging how much of that daily allowance their offering provides. And it's expressly, succinctly expressed as 1 serving provides 20% of your daily recommended allowance. Well, what exactly is 1 serving? Daily allowance for a 120-pound pregnant woman, or daily allowance for a 19 stone 6'4" shredded bodybuilder, or the self-selected average of the consumer who buys this product. Again, what's being sampled? Maybe it's the claim that on average, of an average serving, provides 20% of a daily recommended allowance for the average person of an average population. I mean, that might not even be true according to which population is being considered in the sample for the calculation. Is it randomized? Is it clustered? Stratified clustering? And this is where you've got to understand how the data is collected and how it's been processed, how it's been analysed, and what the statistical methods are. You know, none of this stuff, you know, mathematics, the calculations, the data, the statistics, the hypothesis, the taxonomy, the rhetoric, none of it exists in a vacuum. That's kind of the overarching theme here. So later on, you know, I'll state it explicitly that one of the attributes or properties of woo-woo or pseudo-science is that suddenly it pops out of nowhere. And that's a red flag. It's not connected to anything. It just pops out. It stands out on its own. It's not the way things generally work. You know, it's a fast heuristic to say if it's sticking out like a sore thumb, it probably doesn't belong. So one thing I learned in physics, which was pretty useful, and a little bit unexpected, was the kind of arm waving scientists do. In this kind of endeavour of physics. You think, well, it's precise, it's maths, it's exact, but they do a lot of arm waving away. And that sounds alarming, but let me explain. It turns out it's a useful guide as to how the world works. It's, you know, rules of thumb, it's approximations to get fast results that are good enough. The one I remember is, look at TV aerial. How long is it? About a metre. Why is it a metre long? Because they're designed to be in tune with the radio waves that are transmitted for very high frequency TV. What are those frequencies? Turns out they are 30 to 300 megahertz with corresponding wavelengths, when you do the maths, of 10 meters to 1 meter. That's why TV aerials are about 1 meter long. The wavelength fits in a meter. But for the longer frequencies, quite high frequencies, longer wavelengths where you have 10 meters, an aerial length of 1 meter fits into 10 quite nicely, 10 times. A wavelength of 1 meter will tune into an aerial 1 meter long quite nicely. This is where all that hand waving comes from, so you don't need to necessarily say, you know, what's the tuning frequency of an aerial, you know, let me work it out from first principles. Or you can say, well, the thing's designed to receive very high frequency radio waves. I bet the engineers worked that out, and I bet that the wavelength of those very high frequencies happens to be approximately, to the nearest order of magnitude, a meter long, or 10 meters. You know, so 1 meter, 10 meters is the same order of magnitude. It's within the same order of magnitude. And this is that approximation I'm talking about. So if you kind of get the hang of this and see enough examples, you kind of get a rough guide as to how everything works. And again, from my limited understanding, I think law has a similar concept. Some cases go through an evaluation process that establishes some order of magnitude of likelihood of success. And then the case is either granted permission or allowed to go forward. I'm not sure of how this entirely applies, say, to jury trials, but it strikes me as odd that the minds of a jury or verdicts could be assessed in such a way, or maybe it's more to do with the mechanics of the case, that there might not be sufficient merit to a case to insist that a jury, a valuable resource, is obligated to sit. Maybe it's something like that. I've not looked into it. But in physics, there is this order of magnitude thing, and it's a cheap way of getting into the right ballpark. It's the proverbial back of the envelope thing. Gross assumptions are made, gross estimates are plugged into existing models and extrapolated to get an estimation of what a new model might look like, what kinds of predictions it might make, and what kind of costs would be involved to actually do it thoroughly. So if we're analysing some new power source, does the cost of manufacture arise linearly or exponentially? In other words, are we talking about cost considerations of 2 times, 3 times, or is it a matter of 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times kind of thing? So rounding things off like this gives us an idea of what's going to be involved in terms of orders of magnitude. It's the same order of magnitude, 1 times, 2 times, or is it an order of magnitude greater than what we have now, 10 times, 20 times, 30, 50 times, that kind of thing? Or are we 2 orders of magnitude out and into the 100, 300, 500 times range? Or are we way off into 3 orders of magnitude where we're looking at 1,000 times, 5,000 times difference, that kind of thing? It's a fast calculation that tells us the next step that's going to be required in innovation. If that next step's going to require 3 orders of magnitude in improvement and 3 orders of magnitude in resource consumption, we ought to know. We're looking at costs and implications and risks thousands of times from where we are. In other words, there's a lot to know and understand between where we are here and there in terms of funding and planning and risk management. It's in the region of thousands of times from where we are. So the famous example I'm sure we all know was the SDI, Star Wars Defense Initiative of the Reagan era, the so-called Star Wars project. The huge sum spent on that was really a project to find out what was actually entailed in the requirement to the nearest order of magnitude. Turns out it was about 2 orders of magnitude of power requirements on what existed at the time. So that's a leap of 100-fold in energy delivery. Just for comparison, imagine a hot rod or high-octane dragster that pulls in 10,000 horsepower, currently the pinnacle of combustion engine engineering, and then saying, yeah, but we need 1,000,000 horsepower, because that's about 100 times. Well, it is 100 times. It may well be possible. But it's going to be such a significant project. It's going to drain resources from many, many, many other projects. How bad do you want it? And then other problems are also going to need factoring in, like how do you actually apply that power to the road? And can tyres be made to withstand that kind of torque transfer? And if they can the tarmac withstand the friction? The answer may well likely be no. And therefore there's no point, because you just can't lay down the power. And by the way, the Star Wars Defense Initiative was around the same time as those researchers started formulating the nuclear winter models, which made the idea of shooting down incoming nukes moot. Such a war would only delay the inevitable. Instead of being vaporized, we'd just starve to death instead. So yeah, both these projects, the SDI and the nuclear winter study, headed off an incredibly expensive folly. To cover it off then, I suppose you have to talk about uncertainty. And as mentioned before, it's the expression of how well or how poorly a number is known. The uncertainty of a number or measurement is sometimes expressed as the error. See, again, the layman just seems to think that error means wrong. That's not what error means. Every measurement has an error in it. Every scientist knows this. Every measurement, every model has an error associated with it. It's even a fundamental property of the universe, it seems. Have we mentioned Heisenberg's uncertainty principle? I don't know whether we mentioned that yet, have we? Yeah, so the uncertainty, the error of a quantity is the range within which we believe this quantity to lie. Now, in everyday measurements, when we're talking about, our weight or things on a rule, we're talking about, 3.5 inches or 7 centimeters. But is it 7 centimeters exactly, or is it 7.001? How good are your eyes? How good is the calibration on the tape measure? Well, our application only requires us to be millimeter accurate. So 7.0 is good enough. It might actually be 7.005. The error is there, but we ignore it for everyday uses. But of course, certainly physics works to 4 decimal places of significance, something like that. And when you get smaller and smaller, you have to work to more decimal places. So just to give an example of numbers in the context and uses, again, it all depends on the use. The old bathroom scales, they might be inaccurate, but so long as they are inaccurate in a repeatable way, i.e. if the reading over time is going down, it indicates weight loss. If that's what we're after, it's useful. Well done. As long as they are inaccurate in a repeatable way, they still are usable. It only matters then, I suppose, if we had a target weight we had in mind at the finish for which we might seek more accurate scales. But if we were only interested in losing £10, it doesn't matter if we got on the scales and they showed £5 heavier than we actually were, as long as by the end of our change in diet or exercise regime, whatever, the scales showed a loss of £10, we still lost £10, even though they might show an inaccurate weight. Still useful. So do we want precision or accuracy? And again, consider that along the way the human body absorbs and releases water content by some amount per day anyway. Then the question becomes, what is your actual weight at any given time? It does fluctuate. Is it your weight that's fluctuating, or is it the scales that are inaccurate or wavering? So it's useful to know which one is accurate. Does only the trend matter? In which case, how much weight per week are we losing or gaining, if that's the plan, as it is for some? Are we tracking smaller changes? Do we need less uncertainty and greater precision? So, precision and accuracy. Precision tells us the range of a set of measurements, that is, how well they agree with each other. So if we got on and off those scales several times in a row in a short period of time, and the reading was the same, we would say the scales have precision. Accuracy, on the other hand, is how truthful those readings are. So the readings could be £5 off, but £5 off every time, consistently, in which case it would be precise, but inaccurate. High precision is no guarantee of accuracy. As highlighted, it's the context that gives the numbers meaning. A person that we don't know weighs 195 pounds. Okay, it's kind of meaningless. What's the context? What's their height, their sex? What did they weigh last week, last month? What's their context? It does bug me on the odd occasion when I've gone to the doctors and the doctor's assistant or a nurse or some administrator takes the blood pressure. No problem with that. It's a repeatable process, more or less an administrative task. But then that nurse or doctor's assistant will give medical advice on that single reading. And I'm not sure they're licensed to do that. A bit high, they will say. What does that mean? Is it something to be worried about? Should I be going home and taking aspirin every day to lower what is high? And on this one occasion, I was actually at a doctor's office. I was involved in a near-miss car accident on the way there and got the old blood pressure up a bit. And then I was kept waiting 45 minutes for the appointment. Started to wind me up a bit. And then what do? You go to the coffee machine to have a drink. So you take a stimulant. This kind of thing does get you wound up. Yes, I know it's fucking high. You're part of the freaking cause. Giving unlicensed medical advice. I know they're trying to be helpful, but they don't know. And this is why it kind of winds me up a bit. You shouldn't give advice without a diagnosis. That's called malpractice. Even worse when you have no license to do so. That means they don't have insurance. That means that they are now personally liable for any detrimental effects as a result of people taking action based off of their advice. They're putting their house at risk when they do this. I wonder if they realise that. But you try telling them by offering them this unsolicited legal advice and they start to get all pissy. Just trying to be helpful. Yeah, so am I. Trying to help you not lose your house. Anyway, herein lies a bit of caution. Reducing things to numbers can leave us cold to consequences and implications and even meaning. It's when we look to compare the numbers, like the weight of our body last week, that has meaning or conveys knowledge, or perhaps where insight becomes apparent. Has the weight gone up or down? Let me review the week's exercise and diet. See what I did that caused the effect. Cause and effect again. Now we've linked cause and effect to an observed measurement. Then we've also talked about linking premises in logical ways to reach valid or cogent conclusions. And where we have a tolerable level of uncertainty in those conclusions or measurements, we now might even be able to build a plan of our next action steps. What we've got here is the makings of a method, a repeatable, reliable method. It's relatively straightforward when it comes to things like losing weight, but tricky for things like, the current pandemic, restricting people's movements, closing down non-essential businesses, furloughing some people. Others will be left to go bankrupt, and there are consequences to that too. And I'm sure you have your own example where you are. Hospital beds fill up, elective surgeries become unavailable, that has impact. And this will have different impacts and consequences depending on your own circumstances, your own region, your own political apparatus and healthcare provisions, whether it's insurance or a national health service, all different. And that's why it does bug me a little bit when, Trump gets on TV and says, well, Europe's opened up, therefore we ought to. Well, Europe has a very different system and different mechanism and responded differently than the USA. So, in my humble opinion, the United States ought to make its own policy in line with what it has available and its own resources and its own effects that it's experiencing. The European model might not be appropriate. Seems, a country with the resources of the United States ought to be able to work that out. Are we flattening the curve to protect health provision, or are we going full on herd immunity? Some countries just don't have that kind of health infrastructure, so it may be that herd immunity in those regions might be the better option of really shitty options. Do you kill a lot of people slowly, or do you get it over and done with and kill a lot of people quick? Which strategies is your region implementing, on whose advice? And are they using sound methods, or going on flawed notions of, well, it's 50-50, innit? It'll either work or it won't, and that's the same for any strategy. So we might as well pick the one first on the list. I like the sound of that one. This is the point, though. The ability to make numerical comparisons is one of the unique advantages of quantification. What's the quantifiable error? What's the quantifiable probability? What's the quantifiable measurement testing? What does that imply? Where do we need to put resources? By how much? What effect will that have? Contact and tracing. Does it work? Yes. How much? What's it cost? What's it benefit? Then you can start comparing things in a realistic way rather than just going on, well, I like the name of that strategy. Let's use that one because they've all got equal chance of working in it. So far, so good. Almost. We've talked about numbers, quantity, uncertainty, error, measurement, applicability, comparison, meaning, data, information, knowledge, insight, design, reliable methods, unreliable methods for knowing the truth of that which comports to reality. And that's all good. But what should we do with the data, hypothesis, knowledge, insights, models that we've derived from all that? Ethics and morals.